Let's see. Okay, it says we are live. If you all can see us live on LinkedIn or YouTube, hello. Let me check on mine to see if I see me on LinkedIn. Always super trippy. Give me a minute. I don't see us yet. Let's see. If somebody does see us live, can you put something in the comments so I can see it? I just for some reason can't see it on LinkedIn. But bear with me a moment. All right. It looks like we are officially live. Must have just been a little lag between our streaming solution and LinkedIn. Awesome. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I guess we're still right at 10:30, so that's great. All right, great. Jonathan sees us. Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, Georgie. Awesome. Awesome. Thank you all for joining. We've got a decent amount to get through today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We're talking all things self-service API platforms, what those things are, why you build one, and how to do it. So Mike's going to take care of all that how stuff towards the end. We're actually going to show you how this is built using the Gravitee solution in real time. It's going to take no time to go essentially from scratch to sort of self-service API promised land. My name is Alex Drag. I'm a product evangelist here at Gravitee, and I am joined by Michael Field as one of our solutions engineers and Gravitee API management experts. So with that, quick agenda. First, I'll cover some just quick housekeeping. For those of us who are a little newer to Gravitee, you might not be aware of us. I'm just going to sort of set some context by giving us a quick introduction to who Gravitee is, what we do, where we focused as a business and as an API management solution. I'll get through that quick because I know we really want to get to actually showing how to build this stuff. Before we do that, I'll also go through just like, I think it's like 1 or 2 slides as far as like what we actually mean by self-service API platform. I think it can get a little confusing at times. So we want to clear that up. We're going to talk about why it's important, what's the actual value of doing it. And then I'm going to kick it over to Mike to sort of take us home with a live demo. Once again, we'll show what this looks like, promised land, something already built, pre-baked, and then we'll show how to build that thing from scratch, completely from scratch using the Gravitee solution. So with that, some housekeeping. Please make sure your audio is on. If you can't hear me, it typically is because I am muted on your computer. Or your volume is just really low. So make sure that's on. If you do have questions, leave them in the comments. Mike will be handling most, if not all, of the questions during the session. If you have questions while I'm presenting, he'll try and answer in real time in the comments. If you're doing it during the demo, we'll just kind of pause when it's relevant, and we'll make sure that Mike gets access to the questions so that he can answer for them. And also, please be respectful. Everyone is sort of joining this call from different levels in their sort of API maturity and API maturity stuff. So if anything, just make sure you're respectful with your questions, comments, if you want to answer each other's stuff, as you all I'm sure know, but we do like to lead with that. Cool. So let's do a quick intro to Gravitee. We are a full lifecycle API management platform. So all the good stuff from exposing, designing, securing, all the good stuff you're aware of if you are aware of API management. There are 3 main areas where we focused, right? Where we've been sort of hyper-focused over the last several years. The first is being full lifecycle. We are all about the entire API lifecycle, whether that is designing your APIs, exposing them centrally via gateway, securing them via things like authorization, masking logs, all sorts of things we can do on the security side. Publishing them for self-service access. We'll, of course, be talking about that more today. Monitoring, debugging. There's more things, just couldn't fit them all on the slide, right? The entire API lifecycle, whatever stage you can think of, we have a solution for it. And because we have that one solution that covers all of them, not only can you manage that entire lifecycle, but you can have this sort of like meta layer of full lifecycle governance where you're ensuring that consistent policies, practices, and approaches are being taken across that entire lifecycle because you are using that same sort of solution, which employs the same sets of methods to all those stages. So that's sort of area of focus number 1. Area of focus number 2 is we are event native. So when you think API management, most people probably think of that traditional REST API use case or SOAP use case. We support those. We totally crush those use cases. We were originally built as a REST API management platform. But over the last 2 or so years, we've introduced this event native component, which essentially means that you can do all those things that you know and are used to and are excited about with REST API management and apply them to the event API, asynchronous API, and message broker side of the house. So we'll cover this in the next slide a little bit more, but you'll see things like Kafka, RabbitMQ, Solace, MQTT on the slide. Essentially what you can do is expose those as APIs and then manage those APIs like you would manage them in sort of a REST API management context. And the third is you see IAM. Really, you could call this advanced security. We have all that advanced security on the gateway side like you're probably used to, but we've also built a fully fledged identity and access management solution that you can use for your normal application level, MFA and IAM, but also at the API level. We won't be talking about that as much today, but if you are interested in it, I highly recommend just going over to our website and checking out some of our resources there, because it is something that's pretty unique. I know a lot of our customers are super excited about it. So with that, let's just double click really quickly into what exactly we mean by event native APIM. I see I have AIM, apologies. I have fat fingers. So essentially you think, okay, what is a gateway and API management solution being used for on the REST API management side of the house, right? Essentially exposing, securing, monitoring, eventually probably publishing that, maybe debugging if there are issues, but publishing it in a dev portal or an API catalog for self-service access, exposing it really as an API product. Right, so you can do all that once again with your REST APIs with Gravitee, but we also support the event and asynchronous sides of the house. So a really common use case we hear, we have people coming to us, say we have all these Kafka topics. We really want to be able to get in the hands of client-side applications. There's really no easy way to do that, especially because most client-side applications, those developers don't want to set them up as native Kafka clients, especially if they're external consumers. This is where Gravitee gets really, really useful and really interesting. So what you can do essentially is just like if you had a backend REST API, you bring your Kafka cluster, Kafka topics to us, you put that Gravitee platform, Gravitee gateway on top of it, and you can expose that as an API via the gateway for client-side consumption. But once again, I mentioned the whole native Kafka client, Kafka protocol challenge. You can use Gravitee to expose that backend Kafka resource over more consumer and client-friendly protocols and API styles. So you'll see here up the top, expose as REST, HTTP, WebSocket, SSE, webhook. You can do all of those things with Gravitee. So it can be one API, once again, that you could expose Kafka as HTTP, WebSocket, webhook, SSE, etc. And of course, you get all the cool security things, right? The authorization, authentication, all that good stuff. Managing plans, subscriptions to those APIs, et cetera, et cetera. So once again, it's one platform that can do that entire API management, API lifecycle thing for both synchronous REST APIs, traditional SOAP stuff, and more modern asynchronous and event-driven side of the house. What does that look like in the real world? I kind of point to 4 simple steps. So in the REST traditional sort of SOAP side, right, you might be you bring those backend APIs, you put the Gravitee platform right on top or right in front. You use Gravitee to create that API proxy, right? So maybe you're exposing REST as HTTP or REST. You build in that gateway logic, authorization, filtering, maybe some monetization stuff, build some subscription options. Once again, we'll show you this in product soon. And it's that one-click publish to a catalog. So step 4, your API consumers can find, subscribe to these APIs in a self-service, easy way. So think your partners, your customers, or your internal developers, right? And what's really neat about Gravitee is you think those 4 steps, you do the same thing for the event and message broker side of the house, right? You bring us these backend resources, use Gravitee to create that API that exposes those resources over client and consumer friendly protocols and API styles, one-click publish to a catalog, and then boom, step 4, self-service consumption of those APIs as API products. I include this. It's not as relevant to the self-service API bit, but people do typically ask about it. They're always curious. So I like to include it in most presentations we do. The deployment options and architecture stuff. How can you host and deploy Gravitee? So we are incredibly flexible. I typically tell people you can deploy and host essentially however you want. We do have a fully Gravitee managed solution, which enables you, of course, to offload the burden and toil of managing and hosting Gravitee components as infrastructure on your side. We also do offer a self-hosted on-prem private cloud, whatever you call it, where you can manage and self-host stuff yourself. And there's a hybrid option, really popular, where basically you can manage and host certain components yourself, and then you offload that infrastructure management stuff to us, where we essentially host and deploy or host and manage some of those components in our own cloud. So once again, fully Gravitee managed, fully customer managed, or a hybrid, essentially a mix of the two. Now, beyond just how you can actually host and deploy, how can you actually manage these Gravitee components and resources? three main ways. There's an easy to use GUI. Mike's going to walk through that today when we're building the self-service API platform out. There's a management API and a Kubernetes operator. So both of those are IAC infrastructure as code compatible. That Kubernetes operator, in case you're curious, just basically enables you to manage things in declarative fashion via custom Gravitee CRDs. So I don't see any questions so far about sort of the basics of who we are. So I'm going to keep moving so we make sure we have time for Mike. And we'll get into self-service API platforms. What do we mean? I think it's really just one slide. We want to make sure that we sort of level set. We're all on the same page as far as what we're interested in exploring today. So what do I mean? You have your APIs. APIs really aren't that useful unless they're actually able to be consumed by the thing needing to consume them, right? To make that the easiest, you want to make sure that APIs are easily discoverable, understood, easily subscribed to, easily consumed for that API consumer. So this could be your internal developer, as you see up here on the top of the screen, this person who needs an API. Someone goes, oh, it's here in the Dev Portal API catalog. So they find it, they learn about it, subscribe to it, then they consume it. Awesome. But you also have to make sure, because this can be a problem, right? If you don't do it properly, has to be secure, has to be reliable, and you have to make sure that it's governable, right? Are you actually doing all these things in a consistent manner so that you can ensure that, well, the APIs that I might expose or self-service access are only accessible to the right sets of API consumers, or they're only exposing sets of functionality, data logic, whatever, that enables us, for example, to sort of remain in compliance with certain rules and regulations. So that's what we mean. How do we take those APIs, put them where they need to be so that those people who need them can find them, access them, consume them securely, essentially. Now, why would you do this? I think it's probably relatively straightforward, but I cover it because I get really excited about the value. Hopefully you all will too. There's lots of sort of intricate reasons you might be interested in this, but there are three main ones that we like to point to. One, you can speed up development, right, and delivery of product and get things to market faster. This essentially allows you to create an API if it's something that you think might be useful as a reusable component for some other engineer somewhere else. You can push that to an API catalog or developer portal, make it available for self-service access. That way, no one's reinventing the wheel. We actually hear all the time about how, well, one team over here needed some sort of functionality. They didn't know that an API already existed for that. So then they go and they build it themselves. And it's fine, I guess, right? Because you still have the API that you need, but they could have gotten there a lot faster if they just used something that already existed. And it does improve that governance aspect, right? Because you can ensure that, okay, the API that's being used for these various parts of the product or org or whatever it might be, it's just one API, right? So how it's secured, how it's designed, how it's created, it's all consistent, right? So that governance bit really does benefit. In the middle, and this is absolutely related to speeding up dev, because ultimately it is making it easier, faster for your engineers to get what they want. You can improve that developer experience. There's a ton of noise right now about platform engineering, internal developer portals, improving the dev experience, essentially getting your developers, your engineers what they want when they need it in an easy manner. The API, self-service API platform is a part of that strategy, right? APIs are a huge component of how and what we're building. So this enables you to help get your engineers what they need, whether it's for onboarding and learning a bit easier. Once again, if they need to build something in a bench, well, maybe that piece of functionality or that set of data is available for them already. Boom, they can find it. And also, if you have those sort of superstar engineers, or if you're one yourself, you create something cool, you can publish it for consumption. If you have the right solution, you can see how people like it. You can see that your APIs are going viral, all sorts of stuff, right? So it creates a more fun and engaging environment for your developers and engineers, and ultimately makes it easier and more enjoyable for you all to build what you're looking to build. And then on the right, it is a revenue play, right? So whether you are monetizing these APIs directly as self-service products for customers, or potentially sort of doing that in an indirect manner through partners, right? You might have technology partners that want to resell bits and pieces of your platform, your functionality, or maybe it's something you can just sell to a partner to create that relationship. If you have partnerships that are able to be built on top of APIs, making those APIs available as self-service products makes that entire process a whole lot smoother, clearly. So awesome. I think, all right, I hit my goal. I got through it in about 15 minutes. Wanted to leave at least 30, 45 minutes for Michael to build it. So we're going to show you how. Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you. You can share your screen and we'll dive into Gravitee.
Sounds like a plan to me. All right. Can everybody see my screen on my end?
I can see it.
All right, I'll take your word, Alex. And yeah, so I'm going to be walking through, like Alex mentioned earlier, I'm going to show kind of the promised land first, pre-created API, how this actually looks from the API consumer perspective. And once we cover that, we'll actually show how to do all this from scratch with an event native API. So something that proxies an event or a message broker, something like a Kafka. As I'm going through this, as much engagement as possible, please post your questions in. It's more useful for everybody. It's more fun for me than just talking to myself, and we can take this in different directions based on what you see. And also, I have a tendency to move quite quickly, so your questions will slow me down. So if anything kind of pops up that you want to see, just let me know. Alex will read your questions and kind of direct me. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive in. And so what we're looking now is the Gravitee Developer Portal. This is the home screen. And it's important to note that everything I'm sharing here can be totally customized. So obviously, when it comes to API consumers, like Alex mentioned, it's your internal developers, but especially when you're looking at things like monetization, this is often external consumers. And so it's all about your branding. And Gravitee provides a really easy way to change colors, logos, spacing, fonts. Everything you see on this page can actually be customized. This is just pretty close to how it looks out of the box. So keep that in mind as we're kind of moving through and looking at different components. So again, we have our home page here. As a user, I'm signed in. I have my own dashboard, which is really a list of my different subscriptions and applications. We'll be circling back to describe a little bit more what the applications are and how those are created. But of course, the key piece is API observability and discoverability. So everything coming in here, there's a bunch of different ways I can actually view these APIs and what's available to me as an API consumer. And we'll talk about this more in a bit, but essentially the API publishers or admins have a lot of control over who can actually see or access their APIs. In this case, I'm quite privileged in that I'm an admin, so I can see a number of different APIs in a number of different categories. And so there's different ways to browse based on how the actual admin set this up. You can have documentation on your category pages. You can imagine these APIs being assigned to a different product. We also have search, and this is a full context search. So it's not just searching maybe the title and the description of the API, but it will also search things like any API documentation you've uploaded. So if I want to find an API and I put the search in, I have the very creatively named REST API. So I can open this up to get more details. And so I'm kind of greeted with a home page with the documentation. And obviously, an API without documentation is quite useless. It's like a cracker with no cheese. We got to have it. It's absolute. So we can see here a little bit of detail about this API and the basic things we need to know. And then, of course, access is handled through plans. Now, plans are specific to Gravitee, but you're probably familiar with these from a number of different API management solutions. And we see we got a couple of different options here. This API actually is exposed through two different plans. We have a keyless plan and an API key plan. And so the publisher has told us that this keyless plan is going to provide public access to this API without any authorization required, but they've actually limited it to read-only access, and all other HTTP methods are blocked. And the API key plan will actually open it up. It asks us to please subscribe, and the subscription will automatically be validated. So real quick, now this is obviously human readable documentation. That's just a high level description. But if we go to the documentation page itself, we see they have also included the specification for this API. So this allows me to come in here. I can browse different methods and see what's going on. And so I can also use the try it out mode, which is pretty cool. It's basically a built-in client into the portal itself. And so this get endpoint is using the get method, as you might imagine by the name. And so the description earlier told us that we have read-only access through the keyless plan, which again, keyless is a public plan with no authorization. So I should be able to send this request through without any issues. Let's see what response we get back. And great, I can see again where that request is actually directed. This is the gateway it was deployed on, and also the path that this API is deployed to. I can see the response coming back through, and everything is behaving exactly as we'd expect. Now, let's kind of test out that security piece. Let's say I actually want to come in here and send a post request. So I'm going to now also use the client to try it out. But in this case, we actually run into a 405, method not allowed while accessing this resource. Again, a post method is not a read. That's a mutation on the API itself, and this has been blocked. But I've done my research. I decide this is an API I want access to as a developer. how do I actually get through that API key plan with a subscription and get validated? So that's probably the most important part, which is the self-service aspect of this API. So again, by clicking on subscribe for the API, I can see the different available plans. This is the keyless plan we're using through the API client. And it also says, hey, this is open now. Feel free to kind of paste this directly, in your terminal, take this over to something like Postman and start sending requests. But again, this is limited to read-only requests. So to get access, I need to subscribe to a plan with some authorization on it. There's a little bit more details and saying automatic validation, which means basically as soon as I submit my request, I'll be approved. So I'm gonna come here, I'm gonna select from my available applications. And again, we'll circle back on this in just a bit to detail, how do you create applications as a consumer? Why would you have multiple and other details like that? But for now, let's just use a pre-created one. Let's keep on moving. We see here, the publisher has included some terms and conditions on this API. This is quite common in monetization type workflows where you want to understand the pricing, and then also you want to audit to ensure that this is agreed to by the consumer. So I'm going to accept those terms. And then the final step is I'm going to validate this request. And that request is sent through. And so I can see now I have my application down here that was just sent is now connected. And so if I want to pull up some more details on this, now you can see I've switched over to my applications page. And there's a ton of different things. And I think we're going to circle back to this at the end, again, when we kind of have a further discussion on applications, and especially around some of the things you can do with analytics, logs, and alerts. But for now, I just want to go and see my active subscriptions. So you can see this application actually has a few, but the REST API is the one I just subscribed to. So I can click on this. I can see when it was processed and when it started. I can see the API key that I was granted because, again, it was automatic validation as soon as I submitted that request. So now I'm going to head over to an API client. I'm just going to use my terminal. Again, you could use something like Postman, whatever you're comfortable with. And so I'm actually going to generate something that's equivalent to a curl request. And so this is going to get portal. That is the endpoint. And then, so the get was the one we were using earlier, but post is actually where we were blocked. So I'm going to send a payload in with that. I'll show you what that looks like. And then by default, the header that you send an API key with is x-gravity-api-key. I'm going to paste in my new key. And then we are going to see what this request looks like and what kind of response we get. So awesome. I can actually see right here, I've sent a post request through. I can see the payload that I'd sent. And then if I scroll down, I'm now getting a 200 instead of 405 because now I'm being routed through a different plan. It understands I'm an authorized API consumer, and we're actually able to get the request from that backend. So everything is functioning as expected from an API consumer perspective. But the question is, how do we actually get here? How do we build something like this? So I'm going to transition now back over to what we call our console, which Alex alluded to earlier, where you actually create and set up APIs. But I do just want to pause for a second and check in with Alex and see if we've had any questions on what we've shown so far, or if we're clear to keep moving ahead.
I think we're clear. If you have any questions, do put them in the comments. But so far, I've seen lots of hearts and thumbs up. So I think people are following along just all right.
Perfect. Sweet. We'll take it. All right. So again, now we are back in the role of an API publisher or admin. This is the console UI for people who are familiar with. There's a lot of different aspects we can dive into, but we're really going to focus on creating a new API through the built-in creation wizard, and then actually publishing that to the portal. And then we'll go back into acting as a consumer, and we're going to learn a few different things on this route. So to create an API with the wizard, we're just going to click on Add API up in the top right. And there's a number of different ways you can go about this. We actually have an API designer to help you build your spec out in kind of a mind map format. We also support importing specs, so you can always just pull existing API specs. And then, of course, you can also create them through scratch, which is what we're going to do now. This is especially common for the type of API we're going to be creating. This API, instead of it being a traditional REST API, is going to be a more event-driven API. So again, think in terms of message brokers like Kafka's or MQTT brokers. And I'll detail more as we kind of walk through this process. So the first thing we have to do is we actually need to provide a name for our API. And so we're going to make ours focus on an awesome subject, which is Nick Cage. Everything about this API will be Nick Cage focused. We're going to give it a version number 1. And the description will just be, let's just go with Nick Cage is, can't type live. And we'll call him the GOAT. For those not in the know, GOAT is the greatest of all time, which Nick Cage clearly is when it comes to acting. So again, that's what we're going to be focusing on here. Now, the next step in creating an API is actually determining the type of API. What most people are familiar with is what we were just looking at, your traditional REST or SOAP API. This is something like a traditional request or response. It's a simple proxy that the gateway acts in front of, where you can apply additional things like security or policies, something like a rate limit flow. This is kind of the core of what API management is. But then, like Alex discussed in the intro to this call, is Gravitee has also invested heavily in the asynchronous world. So actually being able to build these same proxies in front of message brokers and expose them securely over the public internet to web clients. So that's what we're going to be creating this time. And the key thing about exposing these message brokers is when you're exposing a message broker over the public internet, it's not really what they are designed to do. Like take a Kafka, for example. It's really designed for operating within your own private network for machine-to-machine type communication. For people who know something about Kafka, usually your security is configured. You provide a Jazz config, and it works over SASL SSL, which is great, again, for a one-time setup for a machine. But it's certainly not great when it comes to external web clients, that there could be a dynamic number of people interacting with that broker at any time. So Gravitee performs what's called protocol mediation. We take that native message broker protocol and we convert it to, some of the most popular and common, web-focused protocol formats. So of course we have things like HTTP GET and POST. We also expose it through server-sent events and webhooks, and then WebSockets for, a kind of persistent bidirectional protocol. And you can select any combination of these entry points, but we'll be sticking with WebSockets. Again, it's a fun one because you can publish and subscribe through it. So that's what we're going to do for this API. So we're going to select those entry points. And now, so the last thing we really need to configure on the entry point side of things is the context path. And context path is kind of Gravitee lingo, but all this is really doing is how the gateway is handling routing. Again, you could have tens, hundreds, or thousands of APIs deployed to the same gateway. So when the request comes in, the gateway needs to know how to route to the different backend services. So the key thing you have to provide here is a unique context path. And so you can see it's always going to check against all the other APIs to make sure that that context path has not been taken. So in this case, we're going to call our context path cage, sticking with the theme we have going. And then we're going to, again, any entry points you select will have different configuration settings specific to the protocol being used. And all you really need to worry about from the WebSocket side is, do you want to enable both publishing and subscribing functionality? And we'll leave that as default. So we're going to go ahead and validate those entry points. And then the next step is the endpoint. What's the actual backend service that we want to expose? So because I haven't actually stood up a Kafka broker, an MQT broker, or anything like that, we're going to be moving forward with mock. But just to kind of show you real quick, if you came in here, if you're configuring something like a Kafka broker, there's all sorts of different settings specific to this. We support all the major security protocols. You can provide them in different ways. You can configure different topics for both the producer and the consumer side. We handle different types of compression. Everything you're used to configuring on your Kafka client side, again, this is where you can configure it on the gateway. But for this example, we're going to go back and we're just going to use a mock server, which again is great for these kind of quick types of demos. So I'm going to go ahead and select mock, go into validate. And so the key thing we're going to configure here is when a consumer connects, how quick do we want to publish messages? I'm going to actually make this pretty quick and say I want to produce one message every 100 seconds. And then I'm going to actually send back for the default message, subscribe for more details about Nick Cage. And I'm going to show a little bit more about how we're actually going to modify these messages in just a bit, but this will be the default payload basically coming through with each message. I'm not going to set a limit on count, so it's unlimited, and I'm not going to add any headers or metadata. So let's go ahead and validate that. So we're going to have two plans on this API. For now, I'm going to stick with the default keyless plan, which again, like we were looking earlier, that's total exposure, allows anybody to connect without authorizing or providing any kind of token. They don't have to subscribe in any way. So I'll start with that plan. And now we can see all the details of the API we're about to create. If we're happy with how things look, we can go ahead and save and deploy that API to the gateway. So we'll give that just a second here to deploy to the gateway. And then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this API. Great. We have created a digital form of Nick Cage, which is quite exciting. So let's dive into the details a little bit here further. So again, if you're kind of familiar with Gravitee, this is where you can configure all the different aspects of your API. Again, security settings, if you have different OAuth resources, things like your documentation, who you want to have access to this API. There's a ton of different things at play. Obviously, of course, exposing this to the developer portal and what we want that to look like. We're going to keep it pretty focused for now on a couple of different things. Namely, I'm going to show you how to add additional security through our plans. I'm going to show you how to publish some basic documentation, because again, documentation is key for every API. And then I'm going to add some different modifications for different consumers using kind of the power of our policy studio. Once all three of those things are done, we're going to publish this to the developer portal, and we'll go back to acting as an API consumer and see how we can actually discover this API and create an application and consume it. So now the first thing we actually want to do is add an additional plan. Now, when we go to plans, we're going to see our default keyless plan here. That's the one I actually created when I made the API initially. But I want to add a second plan. Now, we support a couple of different plan types. OAuth and JOT are quite common, but they require integration with some kind of authorization server, to be able to validate that token and provide the different introspection endpoints. So we're going to keep it simple and just do another API key plan. So we're going to give it a also simple name. We're going to call it the API key plan. There's a number of different options here. I'm going to select, this one we're not going to monetize, so we're going to leave no conditions here. You can make different pages to be able to inject them in here. On the other one, I auto-validated the subscription, but I'm going to leave that off this time. And so me as the publisher or admin can manually validate every subscription that comes through. And we're not going to limit access control or do any kind of special deployment. So we're going to leave all that as default. Obviously, with the mock server, there's no reason to propagate that API key upstream. And we are going to set some restrictions. These are basically policies I could quickly add if I wanted to, but I'm going to configure these further inside of the policy studio. So let's go ahead and create that new plan. Anytime you create a plan, it's initially in the staging form. Let's go ahead and publish that plan to make sure it's available. So now we can see two published plans, but an important thing to note out in the Gravitee world. So my configuration saved. If I were to close the console and come back, everything exactly as you see it now would remain the same, but nothing's actually live on the gateway yet. Those are kind of two different steps, which is why we see we have this banner deployed saying our API is out of sync. The API deployed to the gateway is out of sync with the configuration settings inside the console. So if I ever want to push changes to make them live on the gateway, that's how we have this deploy functionality. So doing that, we're going to get confirmation. Our API has been successfully deployed, which again, in this case, it was adding the API key plan. So now we completed the first of the three steps we want to do. We've added some plans. We've added some additional details. Next, we're going to actually take a look at the policy studio.
Mike, actually, while you're pulling that up, we have it's an authentication focus question. So I think related to plans and relevant. This question, does it have a guide for OAuth or OIDC authentication?
Yep, absolutely. So, we have a number of documentation we can share on that. There's kind of two options we support, keeping it pretty high level, but just opening this up real quick. If I were to make a JOT plan here, this is kind of the more performant and easier to set up of the two. What you're going to provide is how you actually want to validate that JOT that you're sending through or your consumers are sending through with the requests. So most people will use this JWKS URL. So this is basically the URL of the JSON web key set where the gateway can go and grab the public keys to validate each token coming through. But we also support full token introspection, which is what the OAuth plan is all about. And that is set up through our resources page where you basically will link to whatever your authorization server is. And Gravitee will kind of manage that connection with the authorization server to validate each of those requests. And again, that's just a super quick overview of what that would look like. But of course, we can share the documentation. And I'm sure we have some videos and stuff of actually setting that up.
Cool. And there's actually one that I think will be probably answered in the policy section, but I'll just go ahead and ask it in case you want to show anything specific. So 2 questions. about the get operation in Kafka. So when you're setting up an API to expose access to Kafka via the HB get method. So how do you perform this get operation to Kafka to read specific records? I think specifically this is referring to how does the gateway and the API make that happen? Can you request the unread messages for your consumer group? Do you just get all unread messages, or is there an integration with schema registry for producer?
Okay, so quick answer, schema registry, yes. And the other piece is you have a lot of flexibility. I'm going to give a quick overview. Again, Alex, if you want to maybe pull up our documentation page on Kafka, because we do touch on all of this. The only reason I don't want to go too deep is I don't think everybody on the call is going to be a Kafka expert. But the short answer is you have a lot of control. Again, by default, each consumer coming in will have a identification tied to their active subscription. And that can be either manually or automatically linked to an existing consumer group. So if I am part of a particular consumer group and I send a GET request, it's going to start just how Kafka always acts with the Kafka client. This is built into the Kafka protocol itself. And then I'm going to start from the place where essentially the last consumed message was. But there's a lot of different ways that can be overridden. I can basically pass different headers that make me appear as part of a different consumer group. If I want to start back from, say, the earliest, depending on how auto offset reset is configured, that can be set to earliest or latest. And then the last thing I'll mention on the Kafka point, and I'll just show what the configuration looks like. Obviously, a GET request is not a persistent connection. And so inside of this entry point configuration, you can set kind of two things. What's the maximum amount of messages you want to come through? Because, if I open up this request, especially for something like Kafka, there could be thousands of messages coming through per second. So I can limit the total count. And I can also limit how long I'm willing to keep that connection open. So whichever of these is hit first. So there's a lot of different flexibility on how you can set this up and how this interacts with Kafka. But we basically adhere to the spec as far as consumer groups go.
Awesome. I think that that should be the last set of questions we have. Actually, there's one more. We'll get to that when we get to the dev portal. It's about whether it can be used for internal and external API consumers, but I think once we publish it, we'll cover that.
Yep. And yeah, again, the short answer is absolutely, and we'll touch back on it, but you have total control over user and group access. So just real quick, I could create a group and basically only expose this to the internal group or however you might want that to look, but you have a lot of granularity there as far as exposure of an API goes. But sweet. With that, we'll go ahead and keep moving on and take a look at the Policy Studio. So you're going to see a couple things over here. First, on the left side, you have the flows. And the flows are kind of broken into three categories. We have one for our keyless plan. We have one for our API key plan. And then we have common flows. And so first, a flow is nothing more than a collection of policies, a collection of different logic you want to run. Again, this can be something like a rate limit. It can be different data transformations you want to have. But you group these policies that you want to enact in different flows. And because these flows allow you to scope these policies differently. So as we're about to see, I'm going to apply some different policies that only take effect if you send a request and you're scoped to the keyless plan. And then I'm going to have some different things for the API key plan. And I'm going to show a little bit more about how that scoping might look like. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to add a new flow under the keyless plan. And we'll call this a limit access. And so there's a number of different things. You can think of channels as something like different channels or topics if you're more familiar with that terminology. If I had multiple entry points, I could specify that this flow only applies to particular entry points or particular operations. I could also set my own custom conditions. But for now, I want this flow to apply to anybody who sends a request to the keyless plan. So let's go ahead and create that. We can see our new flow has been created. So the other really cool thing about Gravitee is these policies can be applied in two locations. I can apply them on the initial connection. And, this is kind of similar to how a traditional request response API would work, where, if you have the rate limit, you could apply it on the request side. Maybe you have data transformations, you apply that during the response phase. And that's great. I can do that even in the async world as part of the initial connection, which we will be doing in just a second. But the unique differentiator of Gravitee and how we play in this space is we can also apply policies down to the message level. So that means we can actually introspect the messages. We can see the data coming through, and we can apply different transformations to each of those messages. So we're going to be looking at an example of both of these here in just a second. So to kick things off, what I want to do is I want to set a limitation on, again, on this keyless flow about what kind of data they can access. So if I'm going to open up here and I'm going to just search for our resource filtering. So let's go ahead and add this policy. And so a resource filter is basically kind of similar to what we set up on that first API we looked at. Do you want to restrict certain methods? Do you want to restrict certain paths? What do you want that to look like? So in this case, I want to block certain things. I want to block certain paths. So I'm going to configure a blacklist. And so the path pattern I'm going to block, and we're going to create these paths in just a second, is movies. And so basically any request to movies will not be allowed. And then I'm going to do another one for quotes. So again, these are on the blacklist. So I'm saying that they will not be allowed to access these. So I'm going to add these policies. So now we can see we have our resource filtering policy here. I'm going to save that change. Now, the way we're going to do this, and I think the easiest way to think about this is in terms of if we were proxying a Kafka broker on the back end. A lot of times Kafka, they're not trying to come in and access a single topic. You have data streams under each of these topics that I might want to access as a consumer. And so we're going to say that this Kafka broker exposes 2 topics, movies and quotes, but I don't necessarily want to expose those to consumers. I want them, or at least keyless, unauthenticated consumers. I only want those to be available under the API key plan. And so we're going to come here now. And in this case, since we're not working with a Kafka broker, we're just working with that mock demo, which has a set message that's being delivered. We're just going to kind of show how we can actually simulate that using a couple of cool Gravitee policies that will take effect at the message level. So the first thing I need to do is I'm going to modify this flow, and we'll call this the movies flow. I only want everything I set up here to apply to requests coming in to the movies channel. This is the path of the request. And then we're going to leave everything just like that. And so this time I'm going to apply a policy on the subscribe phase here. So what we are going to do is we are going to change the payload of each message coming through. So we're going to use this assign content policy. And so again, this policy is only taking effect if the consumer is trying to reach that movies channel. And so we're going to override this to say the greatest Nick Cage movie of all time. And so we're going to say the greatest Nick Cage movie of all time is Vampire's Kiss. And for anybody who sees that, that is not an opinion, that is a fact. So we're going to include that with our API. And again, we can see this is now going to apply this to the subscribe phase. So we're going to save that. And we're going to do the exact same thing, just real quick, but now we're going to do something very similar for the quotes flow. And we're going to apply that to the quotes channel. Go ahead and create this, see our quotes flow here, and we're going to apply the same policy, but now we're going to apply different content. And we're going to say the greatest Nick Cage quote of all time is, of course, from Vampire's Kiss, is a vampire. A vampire. Love typing live, but there we go. Anybody who has not seen this movie, can't recommend it enough for a weird experience seeing Nick Cage in full form. All right, so now we have that saved. Again, we can see our 2 flows with event messages. Again, make sure we deploy these changes so they're live on the gateway. Now we have everything configured how we want. I'm going to show this and how this actually acts, again, from the perspective of the consumer and what this will look like. But we will circle back to this again when we go back to looking at the developer portal. Now, the last thing we need to do is explain how this all works to the consumer. And the best way to do that is, of course, through adding some documentation. So I'm going to quickly just build out a markdown page and say Cage API. And, there's different ways you can import markdown files. You can link this to use our fetchers to kind of pull in markdown files if you have them stored inside of a different repository and you don't want to manage this. But again, just for right now, I'm going to just type out a very basic documentation page and just say this is all about Nick Cage. And then I'm going to say we have channels or topics. We'll say this API has 2 topics available. And then we will say there is a movies topic and a quotes topic that you can reach. And to access these topics, we're going to say you need to subscribe to the API key plan. So now we have a little bit of basic information. Obviously, you want to build this out a little bit more, but for now, we're going to go ahead and save and publish that page. And we can see this page is published here. Again, you can build out a different folder structure, add all the documentation you might want. But at this point, our API is looking pretty good for what we want to make available to our consumer. We're feeling pretty confident in it. And so we're actually going to publish this to the portal. So again, each of these are toggles. We already started the API, so the only option is to stop it. It's already up and running on the gateway. But if we want people to know about it, we need to publish it. The other option here is I can make this API public. Public means everybody in the world can see it. But again, touching back to the question we had, if you leave it private, which is what it is now, then the only people who can see it are people either you explicitly add or you add as part of a group. Now, again, I'm kind of playing a role of API creator and consumer, so I'm going to be able to see the API, so I can leave it as is. All right, so now we're going to jump back into our role as API consumer and revisit the developer portal.
And Mike, one question about policies, since we just wrapped all that up. One person is asking if we can write custom policies not covered by out-of-the-box ones.
Yep, absolutely. So we have, we're probably close to 70 out-of-the-box policies right now. And 2 of these policies, we have a Groovy policy, which allows you to use the Groovy scripting language. We also have a JavaScript policy that allows you to write in JavaScript, as the name suggests. And so you can write custom code using our built-in policies. So that solves almost every use case right there. But we also have a number of our customers who do build out custom policies, which we fully support. And we actually have a quick guide in the basics of how to do that inside of our documentation. And we can also link to an awesome blog post by our in-house developer. A shout out to Yan, who wrote that on the actual process around everything you need to know to build your own policies. And so basically, if you know a little bit of Java, we have a framework built out that really helps you build out those custom policies. And that really has a lot of power when it comes to, some place we see this where, healthcare has some pretty tight restrictions, as you might imagine, around how different protocol works, if you're familiar with things like FHIR. And so we've seen customers come in and build policies to help them meet those kind of standards and security checks around those very specific protocols in the form of a custom policy. So a long way of saying, yes, absolutely, we support custom policies, but there's a ton of flexibility there. Anything else, Alex, or all good?
No, we had one person saying that Con Air is actually the best Nick Cage movie, but I've already commented saying they're wrong. It sure is Vampire's Kiss, but I think we can continue with that.
Con Air is up there, but it definitely doesn't compare to Vampire's Kiss, but it's a good movie. All right, so we'll keep moving, and let's take a look at our new API. So we can see that this has been published to the developer portal. It's running. It's doing exactly what we want. So let's go over here. And so again, we're going to see our very basic documentation page. And again, talking about the channels, and of course you can build this out however you want. But now let's say I'm a new consumer. Let's pretend I don't have an application created and I do want to access this API. So the first thing I would do is come over here to applications. Let's pretend I don't have a bunch of different ones created, and I'll go ahead and create an app. And of course, because I want to access the Nick Cage API, I got to be a Nick Cage fan. And we'll just say world's #1 fan. And so just real quick, an overview on applications and why you might want these. Anybody's kind of familiar with, OAuth flows. This probably already makes a lot of sense as far as, an application has a client ID associated with it. For anything like an OAuth flow, a client ID is how you're going to basically have a token associated with you. You're the audience for that token. And it's tied to those flows, absolutely. But even for something like an API key flow, the API key will be assigned to my application when a publisher approves a subscription, which we'll show here in just a second. And that's how the gateway identifies requests. So if I pass my API key through, and the gateway is able to identify my application. And so inside of the logs, as a publisher or admin, I'm able to filter by different applications. I can block certain applications if there's any bad behaviors. It gives you a lot of flexibility of control. And then from the consumer perspective, I also have access to logs and analytics on different applications. And so obviously I don't want the same API key for if I have two different web applications, or I have a machine-to-machine application that's running constantly in a web application associated with login requests. I want those metrics to be separated. And so again, that's why you have this additional unit of abstraction, which is the application. So I'm going to make a very basic one. Again, you can see these different types, which these are tied to OAuth flows, but then you have to set up configuration with an authorization server. So we're just going to use this simple application type. This can be disabled if you don't want people doing this in production, because I'm going to provide my own client ID. People doing that in production, but again, that can be disabled. We're going to subscribe separately. And we're going to go ahead and create our app. So perfect. That all looks good. We're going to jump back to our catalog, search for our boy, Nick. You see our Nick Cage API again. And now we want to go to subscribe. So again, what we see here is we see our default keyless plan and we see our API key plan. Now, again, this is exposed. It is exposed to the keyless plan. So kind of showing what that will look like. Now, let's keep in mind here, in this case, we expose it through the WebSocket protocol. So if you're not familiar, WebSocket is just a command line tool that's going to allow us to interact with this. And then if we go back and look at it, again, this is exposed to the context path cage. So that's the actual API that we want to hit. And so what this is going to do is open up a WebSocket connection. And we're going to get that default message back. Again, that's what our mock broker is posting. You need to subscribe for more details about Nick Cage. Now, just to kind of show that we're going to be blocked by that blacklist. Let's say I send that same request through, but now I want to access, I want more information. I want to know about movies. Oh, well, we didn't fully block it. We just did not apply. Let's go back and take a look. So we have our limit access. We have our resource filtering policy. And so let's actually add in, just because, let's go ahead and block everything that's past that point. Go ahead and save that change. Again, anytime we add a change, we need to redeploy. Let's make sure our filter is behaving as expected. Give that a second to redeploy to the gateway. And we're still not blocking. Always fun doing live debugging. Let's see if I can catch anything real quickly. Let's also make sure we have this applied to all channels. And let's specifically add it to our WebSocket entry point. And let's double check this one more time on our blacklist. And it should be set for all methods. So I might be missing something here obvious, and I'm gonna have to follow up as to why, but hopefully we'll still be able to show some of the additional flows. Let's try this one more time. If this doesn't work, I will circle back on why I set this up wrong, which is unfortunate on the live demo. But let's see one more time if I'm able to do this. Just to be safe here, let's actually take that out. One more time. Okay, there we go. So I'll circle back and see what I missed on the configuration there. But as we can see now, nothing is coming through on that keyless plan. So the block is now working as expected. Get to do a little bit of live debugging in front of the crowd. Hopefully not too large, solve that mistake. But now let's go back. Let's actually do, again, what we did previously. Let's try to subscribe and get access to an API key. So let's select the new application that I just created. Go through the same flow as before. We see this time there's no general terms because I did not add any as part of the plan. Let's go ahead and validate that request. And so jumping into our application, again, we have our new application here. If I take a look inside of here, I'm going to see my subscription request, but it's a status awaiting. It was not approved. So one more time, acting as the admin, if I will see, I will be notified. Again, you can kind of set up how you want these notifications to come through. But inside the portal, I can see a new subscription request has come through. Again, I get all the details. I get to see the user. I get to see which application that they want access to. And then I can manually validate the subscription. And there's a lot of different control here that I can add. I can set an expiration date on this API key. I can reply back to them. If you want to use your own custom API keys, that's an option as well. So I'm going to let Gravitee generate it on my own. And again, so we can see it has generated a key for us. You can revoke this key. You can add an expiration date. You can always renew that key, and you have total control to close the subscription for this particular application. Again, a subscription is a pair between a single application and a single plan. And so that gives you a lot of granularity as far as control goes. So now let's jump back here. Let's go ahead and refresh to see if we get an update on that status. And we do. So just like before, now if I click this, I have an API key that's been granted to me. So let's see how things look now. So now if I come back in here, and what we're going to do is to pass in with a WebSocket connection, I need to supply the API key as a query parameter. And so the default is just API key. And WebSocket's not going to like this if it's not in quotes. So let's now see if we can get around the resource filtering policy, and we do. And also notice that the payload has been transformed. Instead of like previous, instead of that default subscribe for more details, we're getting a totally different payload. And again, you can imagine this being like the movies here being like a different Kafka topic. It's going to look a little bit different because instead of using an assigned content to set the payload, obviously that's going to be a different Kafka topic returning different data as it's being published or streamed to that topic. But again, this is kind of a cool example of the power that you do have. And then one other piece is let's now switch. Let's try the other topic, passing in an additional route. And so the greatest Nick Cage quote is, "I'm a vampire, I'm a vampire." And so everything is working as expected. So there were a few other things I wanted to show, especially around application logs from the consumer perspective and what this would look like. But I'm cognizant that we are coming up to time. So I want to check back with you, Alex, and see if we've had any questions coming through. And if not, I can show a little bit about logs and alerts from the consumer side of things.
Yeah. So there's actually two questions. One actually has to do with logging and metrics. So I'll start with that. So for logging and metrics, is there intrinsic integration possible with Grafana and Elasticsearch?
Yep. So our default reporter out of the box and everything you're going to see from a publisher perspective. Again, these are kind of message logs coming through. Depending on exactly how these configured, you can get details on everything coming through. Well, I didn't turn on logging beforehand. But you can enable all these things so you can see the payload. I'm just giving you a real quick example of what that looks like for an API that I already have running with logs enabled. If we come down here, this is a traditional API with request and response. So showing what these look like. This is all stored in an Elasticsearch instance that we stand up alongside Gravitee, but we also have different reporters. So we have what's called a file reporter and a TCP reporter. And that allows you to export gateway logs to basically any kind of third-party SIEM tooling. So certainly something like Grafana we could integrate with quite easily out of the box.
Cool. And then actually another one just came in, but the first one, can the APIs be published via CI/CD pipeline, example via Terraform?
Yeah, so anything you want to do by CI/CD, like Alex, you mentioned in your initial presentation, you have two options. Everything I've done in both the portal and inside of the console, every time I click somewhere, is a call to our management API underneath the hood. And so we expose that specification publicly, and you can make calls to the management API, you can integrate with your pipelines, and you can do anything I've showed, including setting up or approving subscription workflows, adding policies. That can all be done programmatically, again, through our management API. And then the other option is if you're a Kube native shop, that's what our Gravitee Kubernetes operator is. Basically things like APIs, plans, and policies, we have custom resource definitions for. So you can manage that totally through Kubernetes. And again, any kind of CI/CD workflow you're looking to achieve can certainly be done with Gravitee.
Cool. All right. And then we've got actually another new one. So two more left. First one's a bit long, so bear with me. How would you deal with a case of credential leakage via brute force? For example, from a user of an application X that contains authentication with Keycloak and a second authentication with a JOT token in Gravitee. The user always changes his IP. How could we do it to block only from this user from application X, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's a lot of details we can go in there, and it depends on your particular setup. Obviously, from the perspective of API key, which we were just looking at, if I go back to our original API, like I was showing, once you have a subscription to that API and you can manage it, you can always close a particular application subscription. So I could pause or close totally, and now that token will now be totally blocked. I can renew that token. So again, refreshing it if there is some kind of leak. Now, when we start talking about the world of JOT and OAuth and actually integrating with an identity provider, all Gravitee is doing in that case is verifying the token. As the token expired, when we actually use the public key, was this retrieved from the proper identity provider? We're making sure that token is valid. And so in that case, you're offloading to your authorization server. So when you're using a JOT, then the actual refreshing of that token is the responsibility of the identity provider. Again, Gravitee will also check that JOT for an active subscription. So on the Gravitee side of things, even with a JOT, you could always close that subscription, which again, that's a way to block a particular application without taking the whole API offline. But if you want to refresh your tokens, that's the responsibility of the identity provider.
Cool. And then, so the only one still remaining that I see is, can the dev portal be customized? Also, can RBAC be implemented on the portal?
Yes. So yes to both of those. And on the customization side of things, we have a built-in theme editor that makes it, again, super easy to do things like colors, logos, fonts, spacing, and anything else you might want to do at a high level. But another thing we've seen, and again, we're happy to share some examples of public developer portals where people have gone pretty crazy with the customization. But if you really just want to use our plumbing, so again, how all the subscriptions work, and again, the logs and analytics, and again, you like our framework, but maybe you have your own team of front-end developers and you really want to restructure how this front end looks, you can also use our API underneath the hood and build out your own custom front end on top of it. So obviously that's unlimited customization at that point. And we've had a few customers who have actually done that. And then on the role-based access control, yes, absolutely. So you can configure Gravitee both on the console and the portal, basically to integrate with any OIDC compatible authorization provider. And once you actually hook this up and it's all linked together, we also provide user and role mapping. So just showing real quick. So here's a sample one I have configured, and I can add group mapping and role mapping, which says, basically based on their privileges set inside of the identity provider, I can map that to certain roles inside of Gravitee for that user. And so we have we have pre-built out roles, but you can also build your own custom roles. And again, you can see all the standard kind of role-based stuff here. Create, read, update, delete on what they can see and what they can modify.
Awesome. I think that's, well, we're 1 minute over, and I think that's the end of the questions. So, I mean, as any live stream works, this will keep rolling for a little while, still be available to watch for people as they sort of log in or log off of LinkedIn or YouTube if you're joining us from YouTube. So we'll keep an eye on all the questions that come through over the next several days, and we'll make sure to get in the comments and answer them. And also, if you have any questions, you can reach out to either Mike or I individually on LinkedIn, or you can go to our website and hit the contact us form. That'll get right to us. So just real quick, as we wrap up, I want to kind of cover next steps. I mentioned I would in the agenda. If this is something that you're looking to get done fast, if you want to get to sort of this promised land of self-service API access, the best way to do that quickly really is to set some time up with someone like a Mike. We can set up a free consultation or consultory session to make that happen. We can look at your use case, see if this kind of thing makes sense, and we can get you set up with a free POC with Grav to see how it specifically might fit your organization's context. Or if you're not ready to do that and you do want to learn a bit more, you can go download what we actually have an ungated self-service API platform white paper that covers a lot of what we discussed today, but in written format, easy to share with your team. So I'll make sure to put all of that in the link to both of those, the free consultation and some time or the link to get to the white paper. I'll make sure all that gets in the comments. It does look like maybe we do have one more, actually. Sorry, Mike, I know that we're keeping you late here. Can we create different views for internal and external users of Developer Portal and also do different RBAC integrations, example, Active Directory for internal Keycloak, for example?
Yes, also to both of those. So if you want to do totally different views, that's a little bit different than what I was showing as far as, assigning those roles with the user and role mapping. Basically, Gravitee will support full multi-tenancy of the portal, which is managed through something like Cockpit. So what you can do then is basically deploy different environments for different users. But that's kind of a much longer topic to dive into. But yes, we do support that. And then for role-based access integration, yes, as far as the user and role mapping, you could basically have two different identity providers set up. Users can choose which one they prefer to sign in with. And then, yes, have totally different mapping set up for those identity providers.
Awesome. Great. Well, I know we're over. I thank you all for joining us. Lots of really good questions and engagement today. It's always fun to talk about this stuff with you all. Once again, as you ask more questions while this is live, we'll make sure I have someone in there and answering. And once again, if you want to book some time to chat with someone like Mike, the link to do that will be in the comments. Hope you all have a great rest of the day. And yeah, we'll see you on a live stream, hopefully, I think in 2 to 4 weeks. So just keep your eyes open for LinkedIn.
Sweet.
Bye, everybody.
everyone. Please watch more Nick Cage. Check out Vampire's Kiss.
I can get behind that for sure. See y'all.